From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. We're here for another week, another conversation. I hope you're subscribing already to Free Expression. If you're not, then get yourself off to Apple Podcasts, to Spotify, wherever else you do your podcast listening, and please do subscribe. This week, slightly different take on what's going on in the world. I'm delighted to be joined this week by a star of screen and stage and one of our more beloved, I would say, cultural figures, Kelsey Grammer, the actor, most famous, I suppose I should say, for his portrayal of the psychiatrist Frasier Crane in both Cheers and then, of course, subsequently Frasier, a great comic actor. These are wonderful, as I'm sure if you're familiar with them, wonderful, extraordinary shows that had very long runs. And, of course, Frasier has opened a kind of a sequel season some years after the first. Kelsey is, again, also, as I say, a star of stage as well and some other films. But Kelsey Grammer has a extraordinarily, I think it's fair to say, sort of complex life story. As I said, had enjoyed great success professionally, but he's had some struggles personally. I think, again, no mystery about that. And I'm talking with him today because he has written a new book. It's part memoir, it is part conversation, part confessional, part self-examination, but also part celebration of, most importantly, his sister. Those of you who know the story of Kelsey Grammer will know that his sister, Karen, was brutally murdered at the age of just 18 when Kelsey Grammer was 20. And this book that he's written, Karen, A Brother Remembers, is a remarkable account, not just of his relationship with Karen when she was here, when she was in her all too brief life when she was on Earth, but the conversation that he's had with Karen, as he understands, through a medium, and the relationship that has continued with Karen of late, long after her death. And the book is a reflection on her life, but on his life, on their relationship, and of course on all of the things and questions that flow from that about religion and faith and the meaning of life, if you like, and suffering and joy and all of those things. And as I say, it is a really remarkable book. I actually don't often recommend books, but it's a great book to read, and I recommend it to you. And I'm delighted to say that Kelsey Grammer is here, and we're going to talk about that book and some other things with him. So, Kelsey Grammer, thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression of the Wall Street Journal.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
So, again, first of all, let me get this out of the way, and at risk of impeaching my journalistic reputation and credentials, and just say, so I don't often say this, and I don't have the opportunity to say this to many people, but just an enormous admirer of your work over so many years. Some interviewers start interviews by saying things like, just tell us how you managed to be so great. But I'm going to save both of ourselves the embarrassment by not doing that. But I do want to say, I think your work over the years has been appreciated by so many people, not least me and my large family. So it's a pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you.
We're talking about your book. It's a remarkable book about your late sister, about your murdered sister, Karen. And as I said in my introduction, it is remarkable. It's part memoir. It's part confessional, I suppose one might say. It's part conversation, actually, literally conversation with your sister. And you've described it in some ways as a sort of stream of consciousness almost. It comes at you with an extraordinary force.
Thank you.
Tell us how this book came about and what you were hoping to achieve in writing it.
I wasn't so sure about what it was going to be stylistically, certainly. I was in the middle of a channeling session with a fairly famous medium, at least famous in some of the company I keep. And in the middle of it, she just said, "Oh, your sister wants you to tell her story." And I just thought, well, that's the most remarkable thing I've ever heard. I had dabbled with several of these kind of people before, and many had sort of connected with my sister and brought some information and some healing, I think, is the purpose of mediumship. But this was the first time anybody ever said that you have now a task, an assignment from Karen. And I thought, well, how do I go about doing that? So I sat down. About a month after I'd had the session with Esther, was her name. I write about it in the book. But I started to jot down some ideas. What would Karen's story be? I started with, the fact that she'd been murdered and where she was born. And I started to write. And after about 10 pages or so, I suddenly realized that I was writing a book and that it was going to be, because around page 8, my sister had actually kind of chimed in and said, "All right, that's enough already. You've overdone that section." And I thought, oh, there she is. That is Karen. And it just ended up being a remarkable kind of deep dive into what our past together was, our fondness for each other. I didn't want to eliminate that. And also my fondness for the presumption that I had readers that were paying attention. It became a relationship sort of a hand-holding relationship where we were taking a walk together through my past with my sister and into the things I didn't know about her life before she died and the things that I knew after she died, of course, and the experiences I had after she was gone and taken. I had no idea I was going to start writing in stream of conscience because I frankly didn't like it. When I was a kid, I'd read Portrait of the Artist as a young man, and I thought James Joyce was full of it. So I thought, it just annoyed me, you know. So
yeah, this is more comprehensible than Joyce.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. But it just seemed that was the only way to go. It had to be written in real time as it was unfolding in my mind, in my imagination. It was as though I was sort of dipping my toe into every event and just telling about it. It was just relating the story as it was lived and as I recalled it.
No, and as you say, throughout the book, you do have this, and you literally put it in bold type in the text, these literal interventions from Karen, right? Who is, as you were writing, is that literally what you were experiencing?
That's exactly as it took place. I would suddenly have a kind of a I guess you can call it a download that seemed to be in Karen's voice. It certainly wasn't in my own, but it came from within my subconscious, I guess. But there she was several times saying, and leading me a couple of times. The most specific one was when I was talking about being in the hospital with our grandfather, and she said, "Leave us for a while here with Gordon and go back to New York." Ahead in time, but back to New York, where she said, "You have something to purge, something to get through." And I thought, wow, that's remarkable. And it was real. And I realized what she was talking about at the time and went there and said, got back to in time with Karen again in that same place. It was a remarkable experience.
Tell us about Karen, if you would, about her story, about your all too short life together while she was here on Earth. You spare nothing in the book, I have to say, so listeners should know that. It's very raw, obviously about the circumstances of her murder, but tell us about your relationship with her.
Yeah, well, thanks for reading the book. I do appreciate it. Karen and I, she was a year and a half younger than I was. She came after I was born in the Virgin Islands with my mom and dad and my sort of strangely self-appointed expatriate father, who was not quite an expatriate. He was a U.S. Virgin Islands, so he didn't go too far, wandered too far. But they set up a housekeeping in a somewhat tortured situation, I guess. And I think my mom was pregnant with Karen when she finally just said, "I'm going to take you home to New Jersey and you're going to live with my parents," which meant my granddad and my grandmother, Gordon and Cam, her mom and dad. And I didn't really know my dad after that, except for really one visit. But so Karen came, she was born, and in subsequent downloads, it's been revealed, that Karen came to bring me joy. This was what the phrase was. And it turned out to be true. I was a sad boy. And I was happy because she was there. And that was the definition of our relationship, honestly. We were given a marvelous decade by our grandparents. Gordon, our granddad, we always called him Gordon, was a remarkable man, a veteran, and had served in World War II. But other than that, he was a great provider, and he was a great storyteller, and he was a man that always lit up the room when he walked in. And we just were the luckiest children alive. And our grandmother was very supportive in our upbringing and our sense of faith as well. We had to go to Sunday school at the Christian Science Church, which was a little bit offbeat. They were all a little bit crazy. I grew up with Christian Science, and I still credit a great deal of it with my ability to get through things.
Just to be clear, your parents split when you were both very young. I mean, how old were you? And
I was 2. I was born in Perth Amboy.
Yeah. And then, of course, as we also know, tragically, your father was also killed.
Yeah. We met him when I was 12. After Gordon died, he said, "Why don't you send the kids down and I'll get to see him and they can take a little break." So we spent a couple of weeks with my dad at that point, and that was when we got to know him a little bit. And he came to visit us one evening. We took us to dinner once in Florida with my mom. And then a few months later, we heard he'd been shot. Just sort of tragic. My mom just cried her eyes out. I don't know if she still loved him or anything, but there was just a sense of how tragic it was for her and for her children to know their dad was gone.
Your grandfather was Gordon. It sounds like you had almost more of a father-son relationship with him.
Yeah, there's no question. Yeah. Gordon was my dad, yeah. He was the one that, assumed that mantle, and he did a hell of a job at it. Yeah. I mean, he taught me all sorts of stuff, how to chop wood and how to be a responsible man, a young man. And things were pretty different back then. I mean, I remember I went off to camp and I came back and Gordon looked at me and said, "You've turned into a young man over the summer." I got my first gun when I was 8 years old. We were a completely different kind of family back then. But, he grew up. The pictures I have of Gordon when he was a young man are with his uncle and with his dad and his older brother. They're all sitting there with a rifle in their hands. That was their life in California.
You were sad a little bit, but Karen was the joy in your life.
Yeah, she came to bring me joy is what the phrase was. And I think that is true. We had a remarkable connection. We laughed a lot together. And as she grew older and we grew older together after Gordon died, of course, that was a devastating moment for both of us. She and I just coupled up and made friends together, and we all spent tons of time together. We had a handful of friends that we shared, basically. And she had a couple that took her off in one direction, and I had a couple took me off in another, but we always had great love and fondness for one another.
Take us forward, if you would, at that date, 50 years ago, I think this summer, wasn't it, when she was murdered?
July 1st will be 50 years, yeah.
She was living in Colorado
Springs.
You were at Juilliard. You just left Juilliard?
I was just leaving Juilliard. I'd just been given the boot at Juilliard, and that was a fairly dramatic experience in my life.
Didn't quite cut the mustard for them. But,
yeah. 3 weeks later, I was talking to Karen on the telephone. She said, I'll be back after the 4th of July weekend, and we'll celebrate my birthday. Her birthday was July 15th. I said, I can't wait to see you. And it was just a wonderful talk on the phone. Of course, we didn't have cell phones or anything else, just a landline and farewell. And, give me a call when you get back from 4th of July, and then we'll see you. And then we would set up a flight, and off she'd come, and then come on home. And we were so excited that she was coming, and I was excited. It was like so many bad things have been put in the past. And then, of course, Karen didn't show up. 4th of July passed. Because back then we didn't really think, you can't keep tight, connection on people or expectations of when they're going to show up. So it wasn't until around the 7th or 8th that I started thinking we're really in trouble here.
And you, I think, went and identified Karen's body, didn't you?
Yes.
She'd been working in a Red Lobster, I think was right, but she wasn't working the day she was murdered. She was in the parking lot. And again, insofar as you can, tell us about the circumstances and again, what you went through when you went out there, because you describe it in very raw terms in the book.
It was funny. In the writing, it was just an interesting experience. I was allowed to kind of insert myself into that situation and understand better what might have been on Karen's mind. That was a great thing for me to have a chance to do. I mean, this mission, if she indeed, did say you need to do this, it healed me in many ways to understand her, to be in her life in that time. So Karen went to the Red Lobster probably around 10:45 in the evening and was waiting for the shift to end when these two fellas walked up to her and abducted her, basically, said, get in the car. And so there were 3 gentlemen at the time, but one was behind the wheel of the car. They pointed to a gun in one of them's belt, and she went with them. It's in the book. I write about how she looked at them and said, for what? It sounded just like Karen's. It's like, like she had a real pluckiness about her and a real sort of courageous stance about her. She just wouldn't back down for anybody. But they took her and then had their way with her and raped her several times. And then they had decided they needed to get rid of her because she could identify them. So they basically assigned this fellow, Freddie Glenn, it was going to be his job to kill her, and he did quite a job. He stabbed her 42 times. I've done everything I can to keep him in jail ever since. And he still is in jail. I think there have been some parole possibilities. Yeah. He fell in a very strange basket because they were sentenced to death in, I think it was 77. Oh, right, yeah. And then Colorado abolished the death. Yeah, the Supreme Court decided they wanted to review all death sentences. The Colorado court commuted their sentence. So they fell into a very strange little basket. There was just the 3 of them for quite a while. The possibility of life without parole hadn't been passed yet. So immediately upon commuting their sentence, were in the basket of people who could be paroled. So I think he may be the last one that still has this right or this privilege to be heard before the parole board. He was denied the last time, and I hope to help see that he's denied the next. I think that's in another couple of years. Your mother, she was with you at the time? I mean, I speak, by the way, as someone who lost a sibling too, although not in horrible, tragic circumstances. I know what it did to our family and to my mother. Yeah. For a parent to lose a child is also just the most It was awful. Devastating. Yeah, I mean, I wrote about it once. In a previous book, I kind of covered what my mom's reaction was like, what it was like to watch it, and I didn't want to write it again. So, and even Karen said, leave that alone. And I just thought, she's right. I don't need to do that again. But my mom, it was horrible and devastating. And of course, I mean, to watch her deal with it. And then, of course, I took off to go get Karen. It's basically how it went. But my grandmother, my mom, I delivered the news to them, and the reaction was palpable, just unimaginable. We're going to take a short break there. When we come back, I'll have more with Kelsey Grammer. We're talking about his book, Karen, A Brother Remembers. And we're going to talk more about the impact that his relationship with his sister and the death of Karen had on his life, particularly in areas of faith and spirituality. And, of course, this being the Wall Street Journal, we are going to have a little conversation about current politics, too. So stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
Welcome back. I'm talking with Kelsey Grammer, actor, comedian, and author of a new book, Karen, A Brother Remembers. One of the things that, Kelsey, that comes through very strongly in the book, and you talk about this a lot, the way in which you write the book is, you've just described it, that Karen was there to bring joy to your life, and she clearly did bring, in a very short and very young life, brought you joy. And then you talk a lot in the book about the suffering that you went through. And there's almost a sort of a strange paradox there between, someone who lives a tragically short life, cut brutally, tragically short, but whose life is joy, and you who've had this extraordinary, by any measure, successful life, long life, health, everything. And yet you talk a lot about the suffering that you've experienced. Tell us about that and the way in which, your relationship with Karen and the circumstance of her death and your bereavement, how that contributed to this sense of sort of suffering that you had so much.
Right. It's interesting to live this life missing her. And of course, as I matured, at least spiritually, I've kind of grown to accept that she didn't really miss it, but that I missed her was probably the more functional thing. And I, fell into some patterns of self-abuse, sort of self-loathing. I couldn't forgive myself. Even when things were good, there was a piece of me I was holding back, just anticipating some other tragedy, some other, penny to drop, whatever, with the shoe to drop or the penny to fall, whatever the hell the expression is, where I just held back a little bit because I could not surrender to good things in my life. I couldn't actually trust them because I just assumed they'd be taken away. It's natural. I think it's probably a very natural consequence of what happened, but I could not shake the grief, and the grief for a long time defined my relationship with Karen. Writing the book changed it again. I got back to at least a sort of 50-50 between the grief and the joy that I had known through her. I got to reclaim it by virtue of the writing and the telling of the story. And maybe that's what she had in mind all along.
That grief and suffering, I wonder how that affected you. You've talked about the struggles that you've had. They've been quite well documented, but obviously, again, you had a very successful professional career. I wonder how the sense of suffering, the sense of loss, the sense of sadness, you've had an extraordinarily successful career as a comic. Forgive me, many more things than that. You're a brilliant comic actor. You've had these extraordinary roles which you've enjoyed great success at. It's a terrible old cliche, I know, but is that the Tears of the Clown kind of thing, that this idea that it's often people who are experiencing or going through real inner misery, if you like, or sadness or suffering, who actually somehow use comedy as a channel to either to sort of, to distract themselves or to extirpate that. Do you recognize that in yourself, or is that just an old cliche, an old trope?
It's a good question, a valid question. My experience has been, but now the kind of whatever my makeup is, I believe that somewhere my constitution is a person who's very positive. So I had this extraordinarily happy, optimistic outlook on life that was balanced with the absurd death of his sister, of someone so dear and so innocent and so young and taken so horribly, that it was a strange juxtaposition of a life that was being lived well. I mean, I certainly lived it well. I mean, I had moments when I just thought, why me? Why did I get lucky? Why did Karen get killed? I mean, I certainly went through that. Some of my sort of self-imposed prison was a bit of abuse and sort of some drug experimentation.
Sorry to use another cliche, but is that sort of survivor's guilt?
There certainly was. What else would I call it? I mean, it's pathological, so, it's been recognized as something that people do, and yeah, I did it. But I couldn't ever shake how happy I was to be alive at the same time. So that may be who I am. To find humor in tragedy is a gift that we get, I suppose. I'm good at timing. I think I attribute my timing to my mother, because getting her to laugh was always like the real key. That was the victory. When I was a boy, to get mom to crack a smile was a big thing, because she had her own set of circumstances to bemoan at times. I fell in love with the English language, and I realized that a certain punctuation or a certain, plosive or a certain stress on this syllable or that might actually elicit a funny response. And so it became my sort of default position. I thought going for a laugh was a good thing, and it diffused a lot of things for me. I mean, when I first went to acting school, they said, Kelsey's really good with, a quick answer and getting a laugh. Maybe I was avoiding, having to face what felt like tragedy. Maybe I didn't think it was all that interesting. There was sadness in me, but there was also great joy. And that's the package.
You mentioned your love of the English language and literature. One of the things that, again, I very much enjoyed about the book, it's sort of shot through with some references to some of your favorite. You've talked about Shakespeare and W.H. Auden, Henry Fielding. You've in some ways, and I think some people, you've even compared this writing of this book to the famous history of Tom Jones. Have you consciously absorbed English literature? Has it just been something that you've just, again, in your work or whatever, or have you always had a passion for whether it's the prose or the poetry of English literature? Has that always been there?
Yeah, I think it just hit me in Sunday school. I mean, I remember when, our Sunday school teacher would say, who'd like to read this? It's King James Version, of course. I'd say, I'll do it. And it was hard. It was challenging, but boy, I sure loved it, and I understood it. I mean, maybe that was the difference. I actually understood what I was saying, so it took some time to decipher once in a while. But boy, that language was so beautiful, and whatever my gift has been, I guess that might have been part of it. I love the expression of the word. My son Gabriel asked me a couple of months ago. I said, "Dad, why do you speak so well?" I said, "Honey, because it's the most beautiful thing in the world to be able to communicate." And he was like, "Okay." It's just my passion.
You talked briefly there about Sunday school, and I wanted to ask you about faith and religion and spirituality. Again, you say in the book, and maybe I think especially after Karen's murder, that, like a lot of people, I think in those circumstances, shakes one's faith, right? You wonder why on earth somebody could be taken, if there's a benign God, how on earth could he possibly allow something as monstrous as that to happen? Tell us about your faith journey, because you say you brought up, we were actually brought up in
Christian Science, yeah.
Christian Science. And just tell us again what happened after Karen's death and how you kind of rediscovered faith and what your religious faith means to you now.
Right. The Christian Science angle was my grandmother, but that was given to her by her aunt Leela, who I think knew Mary Baker Eddy, who's the woman who wrote the book Key to the Scriptures, Science and Health with the Key to the Scriptures. Very metaphysical book. She had originally tried to repatriate worship in church, basically by saying, come back to God through a scientific model, through the lens of science. That's why it's called Science and Health. Because at the time, people were leaving the church in droves because of Darwinism, basically. So it goes back to that age-old, battle, which of course, it's still going on. But the people walking around going, well, that had a creator. Well, I guess the universe didn't. So this is a very odd deflection at this point for me. But my faith journey was, of course, abrupted by Karen's death. It was a little bit abrupted by Gordon's death as well. But I did start to find, because at that point I became a surfer, I got into the water and I was water skiing a lot. And I was surrounded by the life force, I guess. I was just surrounded by it, and I felt God in almost everything. And then when Karen was killed, that was gone, as far as I knew. And I was angry about it. And I said, please, I don't want your help anymore. I'd like to just be left alone, because this did not go as it should have. And I didn't necessarily blame God at the time. I just thought, where were you? And I write about that in the book. So I'm talking about Jesus. And oddly enough, there was a few things through my life. It kept me thinking about God. There were moments in it. I went to some AA meetings for a while, when I was trying to kick cocaine, basically. The fellow said, I cried out to the God of my childhood. And I thought, boy, that sounds right. That sounds like me. And I've been through that. But you know what? I kept getting answers. I kept getting life answers. Hang in there. Stand tall. Stick with it. Do not quit. We're with you. And I'd get these sort of absurd moments when I just think, where did that come from? Well, of course, it came from what I've discovered in the book, of course, is that it's right there. God, Jesus, whatever you want to call it. Actually, I'm going to call it Jesus, because that's what I learned, is right there. And my question was always, where were you? And when I asked the last time, the answer came. I was right there, right beside her.
And I wonder how that makes you think again about this relationship you have with Karen now. Right. I mean, clearly you believe in an afterlife. You believe that there is something beyond here. If I may ask you, again, since you say you experienced Karen through this medium, where do you believe she is now? Do you believe in heaven? She's in heaven and is communicating to you?
I believe that heaven is love, that we have an energetic connection with those who come before, those who are currently in this forum where I am. And I think they can interact. I believe that can happen. And I've heard from some mediums, that some people get to come and go. Some people come back for another life. Some people don't. But there's always love. And that is the decisive factor. And, of course, the greater the love, the greater the likelihood that those people are still with you.
Why do you think some people can experience that? I mean, both people here living on Earth can experience that and people that they can communicate with who've gone on. Some people can experience it, but some people can't. I mean, what's the explanation? If there is this afterlife and we're all part of it, what happens?
Yeah, I think this notion that we have free will is not necessarily transitory. I think it comes through every phase, and that you can make some decisions about it. And some are respected and some aren't. Sometimes the answer is no. But a lot of the time, if you haven't resolved everything, you can have a pathway to connection with your loved ones, with your family, with God, with Jesus. All things are possible. That statement Jesus makes, "My Father's house has many mansions." I see that as you can decide which house you want to live in, which mansion you choose. And I'm certainly kind of looking forward to it, although I threaten my children with the fact that I'm going to live to be 160. And they always say, "Well, what's that going to look like?" So I say, "Well, I'm not sure. Probably pretty much like this." So,
do you expect to see Karen again?
I do.
That your understanding of the way we work afterlife works?
Yep, yeah, absolutely. I was told in another session at one point after my mom died, I was told that Karen came for her and was there. I've experienced my mom in certain moments that I thought she was trying to impart some information to me especially about my latest love, Kate, who has given me 3 magnificent children, and we have had the best love I've ever had. And my mom showed up and said, "You got to be careful about how you go to bed and stuff like that. And, don't ever get angry at each other before you go to sleep and stuff like that." It's just really mindful things that came across from my mom to cherish that relationship.
This has been a really moving and thoughtful conversation, Kelsey, so I hesitate to conclude by bringing us into the sort of rather miserable, murky world of the here and now, as it were. But I did want to ask you, and since this is the Wall Street Journal, you're a conservative. You've very much identified as conservative. You're a very thoughtful person. Now, tell us, first of all, why you're a conservative, what conservatism means to you. And as you look at America today and, with the kind of the turmoil that we've been going through politically and to some extent culturally, what does American conservatism mean, and what do you hope for the country?
American conservatism, to my mind, we're certainly dealing with sort of an interesting hybrid now that just sort of has grown out of, Trump's candidacy and his fight for relevance and to stay out of jail and all kinds of things. I think the left overplayed its hand in terms of that and actually forgot about what it is to be American, and that was sort of an issue for me. In this latest manifestation, the Republican Party is the People's Party, and the elites are on the other side. And they're not happy about it. You can tell that. But I hope that we find a common ground again, because that's what conservatism is to me. Common ground, kindness, judge not lest ye be judged. I think that lives in the conservative realm. And that's where I live. And so that's why I've always labeled myself that. And, of course, we're living in Hollywood.
It's a lonely business, being a conservative.
I'm also a bit of a rebellious guy, yeah. And if you tell me to think one way, I'll probably think the other. So, I was perfectly positioned to say, you know what, you guys can go, stuff it. I'm going to stick with this. But what I've found is that the overarching kind of generalization I can make is that in a conservative way of thinking, it's live and let live. And I'm not going to say liberal because I think of myself as being quite liberal, but in the leftist lens on things, it's more accurate to simply say you will live as you're told. And I don't buy that. I'm not for that. And that ain't democracy as far as I'm concerned. And I know we're not really a democracy. We are a republic. And I think they forget that.
Would you describe yourself as generally pretty happy with the Republican Party today, and in particular with President Trump? Have you been generally impressed with what he's done?
Well, I'm pleased with the direction we're going in. I'm pleased that the government is looking like it's going to be forced to get smaller, which I think it should have been. Runaway government is never a good thing. It's only good for the people in government. And I think Washington, D.C. should be as close to unpopulated as any nice enough city should be. I recently went to a dedication of the World War I Memorial. Now, it took over 100 years to get a World War I Memorial, which seems impossible to my mind. But I went to the dedication, and on a short walk from the hotel where I was staying to across the street, 3 people approached me saying, "Hey, what are you doing here?" And they pulled out the card and said, "I'm a lobbyist. If there's anything you ever need, get in touch." 3. And I thought, and they're lobbyists. I thought, you people shouldn't be here. This is not right. This is not what this pristine alabaster city is all about. The gleam was definitely dimmed by my in my opinion. And I remembered the 8-year-old boy I was when my granddad took me to Washington, D.C. and held up this vision of freedom. And granted, it's always been a flawed journey. It's always, listen, some horrible things have been done in the name of keeping America safe. I do not want to participate in that. But what's going on right now, I want to see it get smaller. I want the fraud and abuse. I want that to disappear. And maybe it seems like he's taken a machete to it instead of a scalpel. But, maybe it needs a machete.
Undimmed by human tears, as you say. That's a very memorable line about what a great country. Kelsey Grammer, I'm enormously grateful to you. Kelsey Grammer, the book is Karen, A Brother Remembers by Kelsey Grammer. Thanks very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
Jerry, lovely to see you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. I'll be back again next week with another episode of Free Expression. In the meantime, have a great Memorial Day weekend. Enjoy your long weekend, start of summer, and I look forward to speaking to you again next week. Thanks again.